Well, this evening we're beginning Annie Besant's chapter on Islam. We have 2 weeks on this, and I think my portion tonight is going to be primarily on Muhammad, on Besant's take on him. Much of the chapter is on him and his experiences and what made him the founder that he was. And she emphasizes that the life of the founder, let me see how she puts it. Later on, she will say the life of the founder is the heart and the mainspring of any faith. I thought that was very interesting. But she begins by suggesting something very interesting, and that is that, well, she begins, of course, with her vision for the triumph of religion, and says that the divine wisdom would have gained its mightiest triumph, and the brotherhood of man its grandest and noblest exemplar, if there was in India this possibility that alone among the nations of the world, she says, for their faiths to come together. She said other nations have their faiths, one faith from boundary to boundary, but in India, all the world's faiths are planted. This was, of course, in her time, and therefore here, and here alone, can they find their unity and their consummation. And then she says, oh, my brothers, if it may be that on this land that the gods have blessed, we make religious unity. If it may be that here one nation shall be builded of many faiths, if the Mussulman can love the Hindu and the Hindu love the Mussulman, if the Christian can clasp hands with the Parsi and the Parsi with the Christian, if the Jaina and the Buddhist and the Sikh can love each other as brethren and not hate each other as rivals, then shall be the triumph of religion, and then alone shall the name of God become a name of peace. That is our work, she says, and may the work be blessed by the prophets of all the world's religions, so that their disciples may love as they love each other and may be bound in one as they are one. She also ends this section on Islam with a beautiful prayer of the same nature. So we begin and end this chapter with Besant's vision of a nation united, many faiths united into one brotherhood. Then she reminds ourselves that there are 4 things to study in a religion: the founder, the esoteric teachings for the masses, the philosophy for the learned and the cultured, and then the mystic side, expressing the universal yearning of the human spirit for union with its source. So actually, she's very, it's interesting how much she focuses on Muhammad. And I think partly it's because so much of his life reveals the teaching he was beginning to absorb from his inner contacts with the angelic realm. Though these started rather late in his life, but he, almost from the very beginning, something was in store for him. Now, I know that we're working from different texts. Mine is the older version, and I'm beginning on page 199 after there are 4 things to study in a religion. Can you find that place?
Yeah.
That's page 192.
Okay, for all of you. Ananya, can you read with me? Now come with me to Syria and Arabia.
Now come with me to Syria and Arabia. When the 6th century of the Christian era had broken over the world, Come with me and see what is the state of Arabia, the fair, of Syria, the land trodden by the Christ. Religious war on every side that breaks up homes and separates the people. Quarrels brutal and bloody, blood feuds that last from generation to generation, hatreds that divide man from man and clan from clan and tribe from tribe. Look at Arabia, Arabia where there is a fierce and cruel idolatry that even offers up human beings in sacrifice to idols, and where the worshippers feast on the bodies of the dead, where lust has taken the place of human love, and utter lasciviousness the place of family life, where bitter and bloody wars break out on the slightest provocation, where kinsmen slay kinsmen and neighbor, and life is almost too foul for words.
So she's setting the stage for his birth.
Fictitiousness.
Um,
That was, she was referring to Arabia at the time of Muhammad.
yes, at the time of his birth.
Okay.
I did not look it up. What was included in Arabia at that time? Are we talking about the Arabian Peninsula? Are we talking about Iraq and Iran and all of this whole Middle Eastern area? Was that all Arabia at that time? Persia?
Yeah, I think I don't know if they would call it Arabia, but it was the whole Persian part, which is the peninsula, and then Iraq, Iran, Syria, Afghanistan, all that.
Jordan, yeah.
Okay.
And from what I understand, because I've got a few friends that we talked about the history of during that time, and it was mainly warring tribes at that time. So there was constantly conflict going on, and there was a lot of superstition over what they believed and so forth. So there's this whole thing of trying to bring the warring tribes together for in a unified way was really quite a remarkable thing.
Yeah. And that was part of where Christianity was born also. So it's all that region that had, despite the fact that Christianity was born more or less in that region, it had not been reformed, let's say.
All right. Any other comments on that? Okay, Jerry, would you like to do the next paragraph, into that seething hell?
You picked a happy spot for me to start, didn't you?
Well, it is about a good birth.
Okay. Hopefully it ends happier than it starts. Into that seething hell of human passion, murder, lust, and cruelty, a child is born. He opens his innocent eyes on the light. On the 29th August AD, 570, in Mecca, born of the Quraysh clan, a few weeks ere his birth, his father had died. His father, who in the full bloom of his manhood had been given up by his own father as a human sacrifice, and whose life was saved, as it were, by a miracle by the mouth of the temple priestess, who bade that the youth should be spared. The widowed mother, widowed but a few weeks, gives birth to the child, and then, when a few brief years are over, follows her husband to the grave. In his grandfather's house he grows up, a quiet, silent child, loving, gentle, patient, beloved by all. A few years more, and the grandfather dies. An uncle, Abu Talib, noblest amongst his kinsmen, takes him orphaned, doubly, triply orphaned, to his home, and there he grows up to youthful manhood. Then he goes traveling, in trade, in commerce, through Syria, and watching with grave, deep eyes the scenes that go on around him. 24 years have passed over his head, and he has been traveling in Syria for a kinswoman, far older than himself. Khadijah, thank you. When he returns, she has found him so faithful, so frugal, so pure, so trustworthy that she marries him, and they become man and wife. Muhammad, not yet the prophet. Khadijah, not yet the first disciple. Young man and older woman are they. But they live in a marriage so happy that it remains one of the ideal marriages of the world until she leaves him a widower at 50 years of age, after 26 years of blessed married life.
So,
Want me to keep going, or is that a good place
no,
to stop?
let's stop right there. Any comments?
I don't know if it's one of those things that you don't say, but I was reading through this and it kind of, it made me laugh a little because I felt that Annie Besant sort of gives this, it has a little bit of she doesn't mention all the other wives. He actually had a number of different wives after Khadijah. I mean, he was married to Khadijah, but he also had Aisha and he had a number of other wives, and she doesn't move into that until much later. But I mean, they were happy, but according to the Muslims that I've talked to, his second wife, Aisha, was considered his favorite wife. So
Besant goes into that a little bit later in the chapter, although has her own take on the reasons for those marriages and
yeah,
how they can be seen within his wider mission.
right. And it's to protect women. I mean, it was very much about protecting women.
Mhm. It's also interesting all the loss that he suffered from very small. There is in many myths, you have the idea of the orphan and the child that is persecuted, and things like that.
I think those are some of the underlying mythic themes that Besant brings out in her narrative. She is, especially in the next paragraph, really empathizing with his interior struggle. And so she begins after the marriage, 15 years of a quiet outer life when he apparently continued in his outer work, but inwardly, what she says was a terrible struggle. He, in the meantime, is called Al-Amin, the trustworthy. The neighbors and children greet him with affection, and he's beginning to make a name for himself as an unusual person, unusually gentle and helpful. And then who would like to read next? Elena, while the outer life is thus useful, gentle, and helpful, what is the inner life? Can you read from there?
Yep. Just one paragraph.
Just continuing down there.
But while the outer life is gentle and helpful, there are storms of anguish in the inner. At last, these drive the future prophet into the desert to wrestle with his soul in the struggle that only the God-inspired men can know. In a desert cave, he dwells in solitude, in meditation, and in prayer. The message he hears is, "In the name of thy Lord, cry." Who is he that he should cry? What is he to cry? Rent with doubt, questioning his own power, he, illiterate, untrained, how can he trust the inner voice that calls him? Perhaps it is his own pride, his own self-conceit, his own longing for power that call him, and not the voice of the Supreme that bids his prophets speak his word. Thus the years pass, years of struggle that few can measure, and then one night of nights, as he lies there on the ground in his agony, a light from heaven shines around him, and a glorious form stands before him. Rise, thou art the prophet of God. Go forth and cry in the name of thy Lord. What shall I cry? Cry, the angel says. And then he teaches him how the worlds were made and how man was created. He teaches him of the unity of God and of the mystery of the angels. He tells him of the work that lies before him. He, the most solitary of men, is to go forth and cry in the name of his Lord.
There is another, I want to read from you briefly. In my compilation on angels for Quest several years ago, I included a short piece called The Miraculous Night Journey from the work of Peter Lamborn Wilson. And he says that the Quran gives very few details of this encounter. He said, but the prophet himself recounted more, and later folklore fleshed out the tale even further. It takes place just after Muhammad has been chosen as a prophet. One night, 3 angels come to him while he sleeps, cuts open his breast and tears out his heart. With water from the sacred well of Zamzam in Mecca, they wash the heart and lave away all that they find within him of doubt, idolatry, paganism, and error. Then they fill the cavity with a liquid of wisdom poured from a golden vessel, replace the heart, and sew up the breast again. On the next night, this is in quotes, I lay asleep in my house. It was a night in which there were thunder and lightning. No living beings could be heard. No bird journeyed. No one was awake, where I was not asleep. I dwelt between waking and sleeping. Suddenly Gabriel the archangel descended in his own form, of such beauty, of such sacred glory, of such majesty, that all my dwelling was illuminated. He is of a whiteness brighter than snow. His face is gloriously beautiful. The waves of his hair fall in long tresses. His brow encircled as with a diadem of light, on which is written, there is no God but God. He has 600 wings set with 70,000 grains of red chrysolite. When he had approached me, he took me in his arms, kissed me between the eyes, and said, O sleeper, how long wilt thou sleep? Arise, tenderly will I guide thee. Fear not, for I am Gabriel, thy brother. It goes on, this journey, which is a contemplative journey through many dimensions where Muhammad is shown, as Annie Besant suggests, much of the inner life and what his work is to be. He also is led by the Archangel Michael, who also has a role in all of this. And then he is lost in waves of golden light. So what is happening, and actually Robert suggests that this sort of teaching and perhaps even the encounters were to continue throughout his ministry of the next 10 or 15 years. So he was continuously being, I think, inspired, encouraged, and mentored in some way by these contacts. And the reality of the angelic kingdom, as we'll learn later, was a very big part of his teaching. Very after the unity of life of God came the teaching on the creative hierarchies, which Besant in this chapter likens to the Hindu and others. So this is an example of the sorts of things he was experiencing. Earth shaking, no wonder he is feeling unworthy, and yet is unable to resist this call. So
I think of the word prophet, and I, tried to kind of define what that might really mean, because here's a man, here's a human being, and yet they identify him. He becomes a prophet. When we think of Jesus, he was always a prophet. He walked in as a prophet. And yet Muhammad, we see the development into that. So I think of him when she describes his traits, some of his traits, his never breaks his word, his count, just no negative, nothing. I kind of thought of him as pure. That word pure again. He was pure, and that is so revered. And that's something we're supposed to try to become, pure. So he was a pure vessel, and he was chosen because of his purity to be the vehicle to bring the word. It's kind of what I see, that might be how this became, how he became, human beings, to find a human being of his caliber in life is not easy.
Just to clarify, so in this case, unlike Jesus or some of the other previous religious leaders, no one entered, it's not like an avatar situation, no one entered his body and used it, so he was having to become pure ahead of time, but he was just, his evolution was assisted so that he could perform the needs of the masters in physical form as a human being. Is my understanding correct? At least that's the way I was seeing it.
what are your thoughts?
That's actually well, I don't think any of us can move in that direction without assistance. And I think there's, depending on what work you're chosen to do, depends on how much assistance has to be provided. I just, from the description in here, it seems like he was moving forward with support. And a little different than someone, a master coming down and taking over the physical body and taking the task on himself. It seemed a little different to me.
So that if there were initiations or a kind of baptism of sort, it was interior rather than
Right.
Exterior. Any other thoughts about that?
I think he was a prophet in the more traditional way. There were many prophets that had divine inspiration in a sense, but all of this, he says, is maybe part of his path of initiation. He was obviously at least a disciple. I mean, not anybody can be taken to all those experiences, even though he was not cultivated intellectually, etc. He obviously had a high level of purity. So the impression that I get is that he was an initiate, even though his personality was quite humble and uneducated. But all this, when he says, the angel kissed me between the eyes, that may be part of, his third eye being working on the sensation there. And so to me, it's more in that sense, like a seer, more typical seer and prophet, and probably initiated.
Maria, would you give the name of that writer, the one that you just quoted, who talked about?
Peter Lamborn Wilson was the author of the text that I drew that from.
Okay.
So he goes home after the first encounters, and on the ground at home he falls, according to Annie Besant, probably a little imagination here. And Khadijah is there. What shall I do? He says to who am I? What am I? Nay, says the quiet voice of the faithful wife. Thou art true and faithful. Thy word is never broken. Men know thy character. God does not deceive the faithful. Follow the voice. Obey the call. And the voice of the wife, the first disciple, gives the touch of courage to the human heart that fails before the greatness of the mission. And he stands up now, no longer simply Muhammad, but the prophet of Arabia.
What I always find the story of Muhammad beautiful because it brings to light how much power women had. How much power women had in his life. Because you listen to the Islamic scholars talk about the women, and they talk about women with such high regard and such respect, because he too had such respect for women and all the teachings. And that's why it's such a contrast when you see the strict Orthodox Islamic leaders, with the whole thing of the burqa and so forth, and women don't have any rights and whatnot, because that is so far from the lineage of Muhammad. And you listen to the Islamic scholars that are out there, and they talk about the wisdom of women. And they tell the men, listen to the women. They are wise. They are the wise ones. They hold the heart of the family. It's so beautiful. So it's nice to listen to him fall to the ground, and she has to give him counsel.
So she says, the prophet of Arabia, the man who will turn Arabia into a settled state, a mighty power, and whose followers will carry the torch of science and relight it in Europe where it had died, and found mighty empires, and who will be moved by a devotion to the founder, second to that felt in no other faith. And then she goes on a little bit about the importance of him and how the faith in Muhammad has overcome all fear of death in his devotees. And then she makes a very interesting statement. Such a faith must have a future in the world. Such a faith should stand higher than it stands today. This chapter for me said as much about Annie Besant as it does Muhammad. Her absolute faith in the the potential of every authentic religious movement, and in those who follow it without question. So then she goes on at first.
Can I mention something first? That there is obviously a question of cycles, because what she says there is true. When Europe was going through the Dark Ages, the cultural movement of the world was happening in the Middle East. The mathematics came from the Middle East into Europe. The numbers we use now are not the Roman numerals, are the Arabic numerals that were created there. And astronomy and all the writings of Plato and Aristotle that have been burned in Europe, they have been preserved in the Middle East. So the Middle East was the cradle of humanity. That was their peak in the cycle when Europe was in the Dark Ages. Then it began to go in the descending arc when Europe started going in the ascending arc. And in the Mahatma letters, they say that Europe is reaching the peak, and then it will go into the descending arc. And it will be interesting to see what happens in the Middle East. Maybe there is a renaissance or something. But we have to keep these cycles in mind.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment about the notion of the prophet, because we have the benefit of having exposure to these other religious traditions, and it seems like all of them hold wise men in high regard. But the view of them and what they represent is slightly different from one tradition to another, no doubt. But when we think about the idea of Mahatma, a wise man, say in the Indian tradition, the idea that we get through theosophy is that these are individuals who have contacted something deep and rich within themselves. Whereas in the Western traditions, and I think in Islam in its exoteric form, the whole concept of a prophet doesn't quite have the same elevated status. I mean, certainly in conventional culture, when we think of a prophet, maybe outside of strict religious circles, we don't really have that high of a regard for prophets. Prophets are people who can predict the future or come to tell us something about the future, and that's kind of where it stops. Often, it seems to me. Whereas I think if we were to go back in time and actually live in these cultures, the concept of a prophet may be closer to what we would see in the East, where there was extremely high regard for anyone who was quote unquote a prophet, not just because they knew something about the future because someone whispered it into their ears, but they were actually wise. They had tapped something divine within themselves, in the same way that this happens everywhere, right? I mean, if we follow the esoteric teachings, we know that what makes a human being wise is somehow or another the individual purifies his nature or her nature such that they're in contact with their higher nature. And then they have so much to offer. And I think that's probably what a prophet means in its deeper sense in Christian tradition, Islamic tradition, and the others in the West, I suspect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, in the past, a synonym of prophet was theosopher, which is one that has divine wisdom. So it was, as you say, in the past, the idea of a prophet was one that had direct access to the divine, whether they pictured the divine as a God outside or the divine inside. But it was a person that was talking from divine knowledge. So yeah, I agree. Maybe today, in our superficial culture, we tend to see a prophet, as you say, just the person that sees the future.
The other thing I would add is, I mean, we've been mentioning things about the prophet's abilities, but I would think that one of the most important things is their sincere commitment to serve, and in whatever fashion they're guided to, and to serve mankind, because that you need some focus for all of these abilities that have been opened up to you. They seem that, like the description in the book, he just seems so, even when he was living his life, he just seemed so selfless, and so was very so honorable. Folk, and seemed to respond to just truth.
The
And
conflict
additional
sorry.
evidence. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'll just spit it out. Additional evidence for this line of thought is that in Islam, Jesus is considered a prophet.
Yeah. All the prophets are recognized outside of Islam, and I thought that was really amazing. They recognized, they applauded them. They revered them, even if they were not, if they were not of Islam values, even if they didn't hold the Islam values.
Elena?
Yeah, well, I think for him, anyone who was devoted to God was a valid prophet, because his idea was complete faith and surrender. But the conflict I was feeling with him is that complete surrender to God also translated to a lot of punishing those who were not on board. That's something that is said later in the chapter. For all his gentleness and all of his purity, he taught punishment. And that I was wondering a little bit about. Maybe we'll still get to that point. I don't know. We'll get to it today.
I think we should get to that point, because let's move then. He is able to assemble in various efforts in Mecca, following, but there is continuing following him are the persecutors, and he ends up escaping actually to Medina, and there is welcomed and actually made a ruler of the state. In my book, this is page 208. The disciples begin to crowd around him, and there is a battle, the Battle of Badr, and they happen to win that, even though that the group is small. The forces of the divine power are with him, says Annie Besant, and he is indeed to be seen by all men as the prophet of the Lord. This is his first bloodshed, repelling an attack. He's no longer, this is her take, he's no longer a private individual, forgiving all wrongs done to him. He is a ruler of state, general of an army with duties to the followers who trust him. The days are coming when the crimes that as a man he would have forgiven, as a ruler he must punish. And Muhammad the prophet is no weak sentimentalist. After the victory of Badr, 2 men only were executed, and contrary to Arab usage, the prisoners were, by the prophet's order, treated with the greatest kindness. So, and then this is, and actually she quotes from the Quran on this whole matter of punishment and so forth a little bit later. But this is a story that she said she wants to stop at this scene. It really moved her. So she said, now follow years of struggle, more years of struggle, years of trouble, years of difficulty, quarrels among the followers, thronging of enemies around him. There's been a battle and a victory. And in this scene, the spoil has been divided. And those who have followed him longest have not shared in the spoils, at least to the degree they wished. And there's anger and they're complaining, and he speaks. And this is a very interesting discourse. First, he speaks about, he says, I've heard you. I've learned the discourse you hold among yourselves. When I came among you, you were wandering in darkness, and the Lord gave you the right direction. You were suffering, and he made you happy. At enmity among yourselves, and he has filled your hearts with brotherly love and concord. Was it not so? Tell me. And they say, yes, indeed, it is as you say. And then he goes on and he says, not by me, but by the Lord. And furthermore, he says to them, I would have testified to this. I came to you rejected as an impostor, and you believed in me. I came as a helpless fugitive, and you assisted me. Poor and an outcast, and you gave me asylum. Comfortless, and you comforted me. Why disturb your hearts because of the things of this life? Are you not satisfied that others should obtain the flocks and the camels while you go back to your homes with me in your midst? By him who holds my life in his hands, I shall never abandon you. If all mankind went one way and the Ansar another, verily I would join the Ansar, that's my people. So, and as he spoke, the warriors wept. The tears ran upon their beards. And they said, yea, prophet of God, we are well satisfied with our share. I thought this was quite, and then she continues, oh, my Hindu brothers, who know nothing of the great Arabian prophet, do you not feel this fascination? The power in him that made men suffer tortures and face death for his sake, that has made the love for him last through the centuries? And yet so much did he insist on his own imperfections. I am only a man. Even that love never deified him. Then she goes on to two main accusations that have been brought against him: that he married 9 wives, and he preached war and extermination and brutal, bloody slaying of the unbeliever. Pablo Minity, would you like to read the first part? 2 main accusations have been brought against him. On my book, it's 2:11.
.206 in the newer book.
Can you find that, Pablo?
206, yes. Are you going to read?
Yeah. 2 main accusations have been brought against him. One, that in his later years he married 9 wives. True, but is it likely that the man who is in the full flush or youthful vigor, and young men of 4 and 20 marry a woman, much his senior, and remain faithful to her for 26 years? At 50 years of age, when the passions are dying, marry for lust and sexual passion. And if you look at the woman whom he married, you will find that by very one of them, an alliance was made for his people, or something was gained for his followers, or the woman was in sore need of protection. Continue reading.
No, is there any comment on that? That varies a little from this, what you said, Ananya, about him when he was married to Kadisha, that he had other wives at the same time. Besant is implying that after her death, he took on additional wives.
Yeah, and I mean, historically, I don't think that's accurate. Because from what I've understood from the Islamic scholars, he was married to several women and fathered many children. But Khadija was his first wife. I mean, the story that they talk about is that she was, he was a young man. He was 24 years old and he married a woman who was, I don't know, 15 years older than himself. So, and it was, she actually had her own business. She was a very strong woman.
Well, he was an employee.
He traveled for her. So he was a merchant for her.
Okay.
And it's funny because there's not mention of the other wives. There's mention of Aisha, because Aisha became one of his devotees as well, one of his disciples, and she would counsel him. There's stories about Aisha counseling him and giving him and soothing him when he was feeling, what am I doing? Questioning himself. So.
But was that at the time he was married to the first wife?
From what I understand, that's how I understand it, is that he was married, I mean, that he had these other wives, but you don't hear so much about the other 8 wives or 7 wives or whatever it is. None of them really come up in the stories, but Aisha and Khadija do. So I don't know why that significance is there.
I think that he really don't marry them. There are no wives, but he want to protect them. He is a protection. Instead for the woman to be alone on the street, he give it like a refuge. But there were no for other things, no like a wife. It was more to be in his place and protect them, to protect the woman to be used for whatever it was.
Well, Annie Besant is suggesting that when he took on the 9 wives, he was in his older years. And she was saying in his younger years, he was very faithful to the one. And then the 9 wives came in his old age. So who knows?
Well, and I guess I had, monogamy, a marriage, one man, one woman or whatever, is not, actually a standard. Now, I thought that they did not practice monogamous relationships as much, that it was standard that a lot of those who lived in those parts of the world had many wives, and in some cultures, your wife may live someplace else and you would visit her. And so if you had 5 wives, you may spend some time with this wife and then you go to another location, spend time with that wife. And that's kind of the way you lived. So, you could interpret, maybe he spent most of his time with first wife. I don't know. But I didn't think that they specifically necessarily practiced monogamous relationships, and it was not a wrong thing to do. It was just culturally, that's the way it was done. But
If we can mention the very rich man who built the Taj Mahal, he has
Shah
100 wives, but
Right.
only one.
13 different
he knows.
wives.
Huh?
He had 13 wives.
Okay, don't make a difference.
No, and but
Thirteen
the
or 100.
other thing that we have to remember,
Guys, you
you
have time to
can't
build
look at
that hall.
you can't look at wife as in from a I would like to say a Christian point of view, because that's really how we look at wife. We think of marriage as the ceremony and so forth. But like within the indigenous tribes, I'm the sister wife of an elder of mine. And because I'm the sister to his wife, but I also do caretaking for my elder. So I'm put into this position of being the sister wife, where if he needs something and she's not there, I step in as his caretaker. So, wife has a number of different connotations. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're sleeping with that woman or that you're ceremonially, bound to that person. It could be a caretaker.
Well,
Okay,
today,
let's move.
allowed to marry 4, but only if they can support them.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the big things. You are not allowed to take on, in the Islamic faith, more wives than you can care for. You have to educate all of your children. You shouldn't be asking other people for money. No baby mamas.
Okay, let's move on. They say he preached war and extermination. Doug, you want to read that?
Yes. But they say he preached war and extermination and brutal, bloody slayings of the unbeliever. It has even been held and laid down by Muslim legislators that when there are 2 commands, one of which is absolute, such as slay the infidel, and the other conditional, such as slay the infidel when he attacks you, it will not let you practice your religion, that the condition, the limitation, is to be added to every such absolute command. This ruling is borne out over and over again by the words of the Al-Quran himself, as well as by the practice of the Prophet. Concerning the infidels, he says, that if they desist from opposing thee, what is already past shall be forgiven them. But if they return to attack thee, the exemplary punishment of the former opposers of the Prophet is already past, and the like shall be inflicted on them. Therefore fight against them until there be no opposition in favor of idolatry, and the religion be holy God's. If they desist, verily God seek that which they do. But if they turn back, know that God is your patron, and he is the best patron and the best helper. And also, invite men unto the way of thy Lord, by wisdom and mild exhortation, and dispute with them in the most condescending matter. For thy Lord well knoweth him who strayeth from his path, and he well knoweth those who are rightly directed.
I think we can stop there. We have only a few minutes more. It is noted here that he gave what she calls a remarkable definition of an infidel, and simply that an infidel was an unjust doer, someone who had strayed from the path. That's my words. evil actors and not those only outside Islam. So Islam, she says, in the mouth of Muhammad was by no means identical with that of his followers. In other words, what followers of Islam are not necessarily, could definitely be bad actors. They could be infidels if they're misusing the religion for their own purposes. So then she says, and I'll read this just real quickly. Is it fair to ignore these teachings spoken in the midst of war, struggle, and oppression, and pitch only upon the phrases which were spoken to inspire a minority to battle against a majority? As every general would speak when he's going into battle? Such were the words spoken by the prophet as absolute commands. And look at his own conduct as illustrating his teaching. Never a wrong done to him that he did not forgive. Never an injury that he was not ready to pardon. Oh, my brothers, try to see a man as he is, not through a veil of prejudice. Ignorant followers often act wrongly where prophets speak the truth. Judge a religion by its noblest, then we shall learn to love each other. Love each other as brothers. And then she moves toward the teachings. So I was really moved by her presentation of his life, her drawing from the Quran in certain instances, and the further chapter on the teachings and philosophy and the mystical side she draws a lot from the Quran, and that's also very, very helpful. But I think it's important. I've enjoyed our discussion and the ideas that you brought that I hadn't thought about in relation to him, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to share this beginning of this chapter with you.
Thank you, Maria.
Yeah.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was really good.
It was fun. We had fun here at House 22.
Yeah, I think that we have to keep in mind when trying to understand this part. You know, Annie Besant says here, in the midst of war, and he was also like Marcus Aurelius. He was a king and he had to go to war. He was a great philosopher and very wise, but he had to go to war and he had to banish deserters or things like that. So the problem with Muhammad is that he was not just a prophet, he was also the head of a state that needed to be formed. So part of his teachings were not religious, they were policing, let's say, teachings about the system of justice that had to be established. So that's hard for us to assimilate because normally we think of purely spiritual leaders, but he had to be also a head of a state.
And it was also, you know, I mean, it spread Islam. It was, you know, what can you say? That's when you are victors in war, usually your culture, your religion, your beliefs become predominant, and they gained more support for Islam, and it spread more.
Mm-hmm.
An interesting contrast would be the Dalai Lama, who is, he is not currently, but for most of his life, he was concurrently the spiritual leader and the political leader of his nation.
Mm-hmm.
So he occupied both roles, yet he adopted, and largely through Gandhi's influence, a principle of nonviolence, and chose, rather than to try, of course, it was fruitless to fight the Chinese because they had no way of pushing back against the might of the Chinese army and all of its weaponry. But nonetheless, the the approach the Dalai Lama took was to flee his country and to basically be its leader from outside of it, and to pursue a path of nonviolence. Now, the interesting thing about this, as in contrast to Muhammad, who, you know, along with Christianity, often converted people at the edge of a sword, is that in the Chinese attempt to try and exterminate the Tibetan culture and exterminate thereby Tibetan Buddhism, they actually did the opposite. They spread Tibetan Buddhism worldwide and made the Dalai Lama one of the leading spokesmen for humanity. And that's why I think the Chinese government calls him a wolf in monk's clothing. But it's interesting the contrast there. It isn't necessary to promote your religion. It isn't necessary to win a battle, because in the end, it's winning the hearts and minds of human beings.
I really like those contrasts. I think they're, you know, the comments you've made have really helped me, all of you, to see some of the background things that I have no knowledge of, and it's really good to have that wider context. I think this is what our study is intended to achieve. That's why the diversity of our group is so important.
The Pope is a head of state, but also is a person who can send the army, bless the army to go to the war. So and it's powerful. It's a state. It's the small state of the world, very rich and very powerful. And so they have the same Inquisition at that time.
All right, so thank you, Maria, and thank you everybody for your participation. I think we can close here, or let me at least stop the recording.
And who will do the next part of this chapter? Ananya, are you